Your line is now unmuted.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. I hope everybody can hear the sound of my voice right now. I will be bringing the chat box up here in a second so that everybody can confirm that for me. But for those of you who've never been to one of my webinars, welcome. My name is Neal, and this is being able to design diagrams for proper communication, specifically in the context of presentation design, but anywhere that you need to use diagrams, this is going to make sense. This is going to work for you. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this is going to mean for us. And for the next half an hour, you guys will be in a muted mode, so do use the chat box to follow up with me. So first of all, for those of you who have been following along, we are in the midst of a series of presentations about being able to develop great presentations. If you go to YouTube right now, you can see the 3 webinars that we've done already about designing your presentation for your audience, about creating a theme and a structure for your presentation, and about visual thinking. Visual thinking really dovetails with what we're going to be talking about today, which is working with diagrams specifically in our presentations. So we'll be revisiting a couple of things that were in the visual thinking webinar. Coming up in this calendar year are other webinars about being able to design your slides effectively and design motion effectively in your presentation. And then finally, we'll sort of put a bow on everything by talking about how you deliver presentations, about making sure that you're confident in your presentations, in working with your technique, and in being a dynamic presenter, as opposed to the sort of person who just sort of reads their slides to folks. Again, you can check out the first 3 webinars, the 3 about being able to sort of think through your presentation ahead of time, come up with a game plan for your audience, come up with a visual theme, through youtube.com/Neal Malik. So my name is Neal, and I've put up a wide range of different videos over the last few years about Excel, Outlook, PowerPoint, Keynote, Prezi, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so these webinars are available to you at youtube.com/Neal Malik. And in fact, I am recording this one as I speak, and so I will be putting this one up online later on this week as well. For those of you who've never seen my smiling face before, well, some people would consider you lucky. That's me. A lot of people like that I have acronyms after my names. I am a Microsoft certified trainer, an Adobe certified expert, and a CompTIA certified technical trainer. But the most important thing on this slide is, of course, my email address. If you don't already have my email address laying around someplace, go ahead and document that. It's neal@nactraining.com, and I'm more than happy to sort of help you through the different things that we talk about in this session, or if you see something in one of my YouTube videos, feel free to send me an email about it. I'm more than happy to walk through those ideas with you. Everything that we do, I try to create a handout for. Right now, you all should have received an email from me having a handout, a 3-page handout for this session. After the session is over, it will be posted in nactraining.com/handouts.aspx. And again, you can write this down, you can scribble this down, or when this is up on YouTube later, you can see this address later as well. So nactraining.com/handouts.aspx. Right now, the 3 previous handouts about the 3 previous webinars are all available there as well. Now, our last webinar about visual thinking and this one about working with diagrams really come from a place where, just to let you guys know, I own 3 books by a guy named Dan Rome: The Back of the Napkin, Unfolding the Napkin, and Show and Tell. And I'm a huge fan of Dan. He does an amazing job describing how you would actually work with drawings and diagrams in business communication. The Back of the Napkin is one of the top 20 business books ever written, if that's not good enough for you, if the fact that it's a New York Times bestseller is not good enough for you, you have my absolute 100% recommendation to pick up The Back of the Napkin. Dan Rome, his last name is spelled like how you roam the earth, is great at being able to sort of motivate you to become more of a sketcher during the middle of your talks. Now, this session is not so much about live sketching, of course, but more so it's about being able to use diagrams and use drawings and things like that, use visuals to communicate your information in the midst of a presentation. The reason I feel like these work together so well is because what he's done is help to figure out what types of illustrations are important and useful in different scenarios. Now, specifically, you'll probably want to have this link on hand. This link is bit.ly/capital D Dan, capital R Rome, capital C Codex. And the reason this address is so important is because at this location, there's a PDF of one of the pages from his Back of the Napkin book. First of all, please, 100%, it is worth your time and energy to go get the Back of the Napkin immediately, pull it up on Amazon, buy it, get it 2 days shipped to you, read the whole thing from cover to cover. One of the pages of that book is available to you at bit.ly/Dan Rome Codex, and it looks a little something like this. So this is 2 different directions based off of his descriptions of what you're supposed to be doing during your rundown for your drawing. So first is down the left-hand side, and it's super duper easy, and this is something we talked about during our visual thinking webinar. You should, before you start off creating any illustration, before you start off creating any kind of diagrams or anything else of that nature, simply ask yourself, what question does this slide, what question does this diagram need to answer right now? And you guys have all heard these questions before, because when you learned how to write essays when you were a kid, they said, okay, you need to answer who, what, when, where, why, and how. And those are the sorts of things that, excuse me, that you must describe in your essay. Well, in the same way, you need to know which of these facets are being described during each of the different diagrams that you're going to work on. And it's very, very important that you recognize a diagram is never an essay unto itself. So a diagram can't answer who, what, when, where, why, how, and whatever other questions you happen to have. It needs to answer one question. It needs to be very, very focused to one scenario, to one question, to one facet of the description that you're working on. So down the left-hand side, he's got those running down the grid. As you can see, this is just a screenshot of the Dan Rome Codex. And across the top, though, he's got his proprietary squid illustration. And squid is fun because, it's a fun word to use. He had to really kind of massage what he talked about in order to have that make sense. But S is for, do you want your diagram to be simple, or do you want your diagram to be elaborate? Q is, do you want your diagram to describe how something is, its quality, or how big it is, its quantity? V is, do you want to describe the vision that we have for what things could be like or what things are, or the execution of how we get to that place? I is for, do you want to describe a single individual by itself, or do you want to describe things as a comparison against one another? And D is delta. It's basically asking us, do we want to describe the change in that thing or how it actually is at this moment? So we described all of these things during our visual thinking webinar. And again, you can download the PDF, the Rowan Codex, at the address I provided earlier. And I absolutely believe that everybody who's on this call right now should have Amazon open in another tab and be ordering his book as we speak. All right, so that's a starting point, and that's where we're going to jump off from. Before I do, I want to switch over. I want to make sure that you guys can all hear me clearly and everything is going smoothly. All right, so here's the chat box. Let me just pull it over here to the side. And if you guys could just let me know that my audio is coming through clearly and that there are no technical difficulties, that would be great. Thank you very much, Michelle. All right, so again, we are going to jump right into an illustration of how these things work because we want to make sure that you guys are up to speed on this idea first, and then we'll move over to a couple of the ideas that are outlined in the handouts. All right, so first of all, let's say that we have been tasked with creating a new organization system for the shared network drive that everybody uses. Basically, every company on Earth has this absolute apocalyptic wasteland of file systems where nobody knows what the newest files are, nobody knows where anything's supposed to be saved. There are files labeled as templates that people accidentally save over the top of. There's a ton of different problems out there. And you are asked to create a new system and implement it, and you've done that. You've invented this new system for everybody. You've come up with this great plan, and now it's up to you to communicate to everybody what it is that you invented. So when we're deciding to talk this through in the middle of a presentation, we think to ourselves, okay, it's a good idea to represent this as an illustration, as a diagram of some kind. So let's run through how you would use that Rowan Codex in order to pick the appropriate diagram for the situation. So the first thing we need to do is we need to isolate which of the questions we're answering on the first slide. So let's say that, okay, we've got our file system. We're trying to tell everybody where things are. And one thing that we can all agree upon is the fact that absolutely nothing was in any place that anybody understood previously. So what we want to do is we want to describe to everybody where everything is, what it looks like when you look at this file system. So what we want is a who or what, which is a portrait of something. Now, don't be caught up in the fact that I just said portrait, because this could be a portrait of a person, of course. It could be a portrait of a company, but it could also be a portrait of a file system or any other item that we have. So this what question that we're answering right now of what does it look like is a portrait. It's answered by the who or what part of the grid of the codex that I showed you guys in that PDF. So now the question is, okay, what other parts, so it's a portrait of the system, what other parts of this are we going to run through? Okay, so if we're looking at a portrait of the system, we ask ourselves, do we want a simple illustration of where everything is, or a very elaborate illustration of where everything is? At least at first, in the first few slides, we definitely don't want to get too complicated. We want to stay pretty simple. We want to stay pretty straightforward. Now, if you notice, during the running across of this codex, under quality or quantity and vision or execution, they basically say there's no choice to be made here. In a portrait, once you decide whether you're going simple or elaborate, you're going to tell people what it's like, what its quality is, and what it is, what it actually looks like, what its vision is, what our vision of that thing happens to be. Not how we executed some sort of plan, but just what is that thing right now. So the last two questions we have to ask ourselves off this codex are, do we want to show the individual file system, or do we want to see it as a comparison to other file systems? Until you get challenged by one of your coworkers, there's really no reason whatsoever to complicate things by showing other potential file systems, right? Let's say you get 100 people in a room together with you, and you say, okay, everybody, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to show you all the file system possibilities that I ran through and threw away and discarded before I landed on the right one. How on earth is that a good presentation, right? You're just confusing things with every moment that you're talking about the comparisons to other things. So we're going to talk about the individual, and in the same way over there at change or as is, nobody knew where anything was in the first place, so showing the change from the old system is really too much complication for us. So we're going to stick with as is here. Okay, so what we're doing here is we are showing how things are in a simple way with no other comparisons on the screen. So what does that look like to me? It's interesting. It looks like that. I know I just got done talking to you guys about the fact that this is all about diagrams. So you're thinking about flowcharts, you're thinking about timelines, you're thinking about all these different types of things. But really, when we think diagrams, what we should be thinking is, how are we going to find the right visualization for the information that we have on hand? And a simple snapshot of the way things are is what we have right in front of us right now. The folder system that we have showing people exactly the structure that they need in order to get their job done, that's as simple as it gets right there. And so our best visualization for that information comes off of our running through that grid. So we're feeling pretty good about that. All right. Rule number one when working with diagrams or any other piece of communication for that matter is, excuse me, that we are communicating with our team. If we can't communicate successfully, then that's a failure, right? A lot of people, when they're designing great presentations, come up with the most interesting, most creative way of solving the problem that they can possibly find. But the simple solutions are nearly always the right solutions. And so in this case, a snapshot of what your actual file system is actually the right answer. Okay. On page 1 of your handout, you'll actually notice I've written a little something, and it includes the phrase, a diagram is a sentence in graphical language. Now, it goes on a little bit further than that, but it's important to sort of run through what that actually means. A diagram is a sentence in graphical language. Okay, what this is saying is that we're trying to come up with some visual way to talk to people. But if you think about the ways that we talk to people in letters, in words, in phrases, in sentences, in paragraphs, in speeches, in books, in essays. Remember earlier I told you guys a diagram is not an essay. It's not some sort of robust thing that describes 10,000 different elements all at the same time. Way too often, people get hung up on this idea that putting everything onto a single slide somehow makes it better. I was at a conference a couple of months ago, and a woman So I was talking about specifically designing slides, right? And one of the things I said was that you should really only have one idea on every slide that you create. And she said, well, okay, if I put one of the ideas from my presentation onto each individual slide, then that's going to give me 100 slides or 150 slides. And 100 slides is too many. I can't have 100 slides. Now, what is that really telling us? She's not wrong necessarily, right? Depending on your presentation, 100 slides may be way, way too many slides. That's entirely possible. But the problem is that 100 slides or 25 slides, 100 diagrams or 25 diagrams are not actually different from one another if they communicate the same amount of content. If I have to spend 4 minutes on each slide for 25 slides, or if I have to spend 1 minute on every slide for 100 slides, if I communicate the same number of ideas to the same level of detail, then there's not actually a difference in the amount of content that you're presenting. I don't care what the actual number of slides happens to be. And so a lot of times, unfortunately, I'm teaching classes for companies. And for instance, here's a slide that I actually have to put up on the screen during the middle of a SharePoint class. Now, when you look at this, what they're trying to tell you is that there are different places where you can create applications where things will interact with your end users. But what you're doing here is saying, okay, well, there are the operating systems, and then there's SharePoint. And within SharePoint, there's SharePoint Server 2010 and SharePoint Foundation. And within SharePoint Foundation, we can talk about storage, and we can talk about admin. Oh, and also there's the clients, and there are 4 different types of clients. And as you can see, in order to talk through this diagram, I'm going to have to stay here for the better part of 15 or 20 minutes. And at the end of it, no individual person will be exactly with me. I want to be very clear about that. At some point in my description of this slide, every single person in the room will have wandered off on their own, either thinking about some part of this slide that's interesting to them, or just thinking about whatever the heck they feel like thinking about, right? When you see this slide, it is absolutely impossible to describe this slide in its fullest so that everybody understands it in a way that doesn't take the better part of the day. So what I do is I take this slide from Microsoft that I have to show everybody, and then I immediately tell everybody, okay, let's break this down, and I overlay on top of that the easiest possible way of describing the elements that I see on the screen. So I've taken the many, many facets of a much larger diagram and sort of rolled right past it and said, let's focus on the big picture. Let's focus on the 4 elements that I think are actually important, so that I can say a full sentence about this, so that the diagram describes a sentence worth of information. Then, once I hit these 4 big picture elements, I can easily go to one of those elements and break down clients, for example, into another diagram, where this diagram, again, can be described in roughly a sentence or so. This is a big deal to me. A lot of people feel like as long as they've created a graphic to describe something, that's good enough. But unfortunately, nearly no one can consume the entirety of that graphic without needing a water break, without needing a little extra time just to sit and contemplate on their own. By taking a much larger idea and breaking it into smaller diagrams, you make it much, much easier to talk through, to keep everybody's attention, and much, much easier for people to actually be able to walk away with the information you want them to have. So, page number 1 of our handout really just talked about simplifying. Because when we try to work through any individual idea, we need to make sure that that idea is really the only thing that's going on the screen. We need to make sure that neither we nor the people we work with ever get caught up in that idea that somehow having more slides makes our information more difficult to consume. Because if we have a certain amount of content, it doesn't really matter whether we have it on fewer slides or more slides. It's the same amount of content. And in fact, more slides make sure that each individual slide is simpler and easier to understand, which makes it infinitely better. Now, our second page of the handout talks about being able to take that content and create a consistent visual language, which is kind of a bulky way of saying that what we want is for our diagrams to be clean and easily understood, and to never give a problematic suggestion. Let me show you exactly what I mean by that. So in the handout, what you'll notice is that on page 2 of the handout, it starts off with consistent box sizes and font sizes and consistent widths and aligned shapes. Now, the reason for all these ideas right here is because, first of all, if your box size or if your font size is larger or smaller, then what people assume about your content, come on. There we go. Sorry about that. So let's say that I create a diagram in PowerPoint. If I create boxes that are different sizes, then the normal viewer will believe that that box is more important than the other boxes. So let's go ahead and scale this up, for example. All right. Without any context whatsoever right now, if you looked at those 4 boxes on the screen, you would immediately assume that the box on the bottom was somehow the most important point, and that the 3 boxes above were pieces that fed into it. The reason you believe that is because size denotes importance. Simple as that. Now, the problem is that a lot of times people have these boxes, and they'll type in one word in here, one word in here, one word in here, and then they'll type in a full sentence in here. And then what they'll assume is that because they're trying to put more content into this box, it should grow. But instead, as you can see here, and I make a point of this in the handout, PowerPoint 2007, 10, and 13 are actually great at this. It assumes that these boxes should always remain the same size, and so it decreases the font size of all the shapes at the same time. It keeps these things consistent so that you're not accidentally giving more importance to one of the boxes than the others. Now, if you were building your presentation by hand, and you did not have a piece of smart art, you definitely want to make sure that when you add boxes, for example, like this one right here, and then duplicate, 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 right? That those boxes are all the same size, all have the same dimensions. Okay. Because the moment that I take one of these boxes and make it larger, because I've decided to type a large phrase, then when you look at these boxes completely independent of everything else, you assume the larger box has some different level of importance. Same thing goes here with line widths. You want to make sure that there's a clean, consistent pattern, and of course, alignment of shapes. If you're in PowerPoint, always take the time to not only click on all the shapes, select all 4 shapes, for example, and then use the Arrange drop-down menu to align them. So let's say align their tops so that they're all evenly across the top, but also under that same alignment you'll want to make sure that you look for your distribution. Now that's because if you were just eyeballing this, you'll notice here that this gap right here is a little bit bigger than these 2 gaps are here. And again, in the same way as larger box sizes tells us that there's more importance, if 3 things are closer together and the last one is farther away, we believe the one that is farther away is less related to the other 3 than they are to each other. So we always make sure to highlight all 4 shapes and distribute them equally across a horizontal axis, so there's exactly the same amount of space between all 4 shapes. Even distribution and even alignment. And then lastly, you just want to make sure don't use a crazy number of shapes. That's just one of those things that will drive people absolutely insane. 2 or 3 shapes is pretty much all you need in almost every diagram. Simple rectangles and triangles and things should be able to get the job done. All right. And so to finish, the last thing we want to make sure we always do is use our design rules. Now, if you've been in a session with me before, you could probably tell me these design rules out of hand, but let me go ahead and describe them to you. Basically, everything in design comes down to repetition and contrast. When we look at a slide like this one, we immediately assume that every new color in this diagram means something new and different. So we assume that Raymond Jennings is different from Hester Wilhite, and we assume that Hester is different from Rebecca, and we assume that Rebecca is different from Kara, because each one of them is a different color down the line. But what we want to do is we want people to focus on, let's say, a few of these people down here in the corner, then we need to make sure that there is consistency in color, in shape, in size, in every other facet across this diagram. So inside of PowerPoint, it's very easy to highlight the diagram, go to my Design tab, and choose a consistent color scheme, and then highlight the individual elements that I would like to highlight and choose a different color for those shapes specifically. And you can very clearly see now what I'm trying to highlight. You know that the rest of the organizational structure in this diagram is basically inconsequential to our discussion. What we want to focus on is the section down at the bottom because it is distinctly a different color. And in the same way, here, when we have a 4-step process, it's fine to have 4 different colors. But if what we want to do is help people understand which facet we're talking about in a given moment, it's actually very easy to take this diagram, change it to a consistent color scheme, and then on each slide, watch what I'll do here. I'm just going to duplicate this slide a few times, just right-clicking on that slide and duplicating it. And so at every step in the process, I can click on the first shape and decide to highlight that one in orange. Okay. So here I am on slide number 1, and I'm talking about step number 1. And then I go to slide number 2, and I go through and I make sure to highlight step 2 for slide number 2. And I go to step 3, and you guys know the rest from here, right? What I'm doing is I'm consistently walking through and helping people see what we're talking about at a given point in time. And so what that ends up looking like while we're talking is, so let's talk about the first step of this process, yada, 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 yada. Now, if we move on to the second step of the process, of course, blah, 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 blah. And then that leads into the third step of the process, which of course leads us to the final step, which is this. And you can see how cleanly that leads people along and that makes sure that everybody sticks with us along the process and knows exactly what we're talking about at every stage. So our design theory really comes down to a very, very simple principle. We constantly repeat ourselves through color, through size, through shape, so that when we don't repeat ourselves, when we decide to go with a contrasting color, size, font, shape, whatever it happens to be, that easily leads everyone's eye to the point we want to make in the diagram, and we're able to work with that. So our session today talked through how we could design and create our best possible diagram for each scenario. The first thing we do is we use the ideas from Dan Rome's back of the napkin. We use this idea of how do we get to the right diagram for the right problem? How do we solve the who, the what, the when, the where, the how, whatever it happens to be? And how do we best fill that diagram out? Is it a more simple diagram or is it a more elaborate diagram? Then we take our consistent design theory and make sure that everything across the board has that same size, the same alignment, the same widths, the same shapes, so that when we decide to communicate something important, it immediately jumps off the page at us. At this point, I'm going to stop the recording process. Everybody enjoy the rest of your day. If you want to stick around and ask any questions, feel free to do so. This is the webinar that'll be going up on YouTube.